Today, we're diving into the life of Marcus Tullius Cicero. But this isn't just a biography. Nope, this is a political tragedy. We're going to look at how one of history's greatest speakers, a man who literally saved the Roman Republic with his words, was ultimately destroyed by the very principles that made him so powerful.
And let's just start at the end. With these words, Cicero is staring down his own assassins. And he's not begging for his life, he's critiquing their technique. This tells you everything you need to know about him. A man who clung to his principles, to the proper way of doing things, even as the world around him burned it all down.
You see, his enemies didn't just want him dead, they wanted to send a message. His head and his hands, the source of his voice, the tools of his writing, were nailed up in the Roman Forum for everyone to see. So how did Rome's greatest speaker end up like this? To get that, we have to go back to the source of his power, his words.
Okay, so you have to understand, Cicero wasn't born into one of the powerful old money families that ran Rome. He was a total outsider, and to climb that political ladder, he had to fight his way in with the only real weapon he had.
He was what the Romans called a novus homo, a new man. This basically means he had no family connections, no famous name to lean on. His entire career had to be built from scratch, relying only on his own incredible talent, his sharp intellect, and just his relentless ambition.
And his talent was just undeniable. He completely mastered the art of public speaking. He got famous in the courts by using the Latin language like a surgeon's scalpel, incredibly precise, sharp, and always cutting right to the heart of the issue. In fact, he was so good that his style of Latin became the gold standard. He literally talked his way to the very top, all the way to becoming consul, the highest job in the Republic.
So at the absolute peak of his power, Cicero runs into this crisis that becomes his greatest triumph. But here's the crazy part. This very victory, this shining moment, is what planted the seeds of his own destruction.
He uncovers a massive conspiracy. It's led by a bitter rival, a guy named Catiline, who was plotting a violent coup to take over the entire Roman government. The Republic was, and I mean this seriously, on the absolute brink of collapse. And what does Cicero do? He unleashes a series of legendary, absolutely blistering speeches. He gets up in the Senate and just lays the whole conspiracy bare. With iconic lines like this one, he shamed his opponents and masterfully turned the whole political world against them. He saved the Republic, and for a moment, he was a hero. But in that moment of victory, he makes a huge, fatal error. To crush the threat for good, Cicero authorized the execution of the conspirators. Now, these were Roman citizens, and he had them killed without a proper trial. It was illegal, a stain on his record that seemed kind of necessary at the time, but, as you'll see, it would become the perfect weapon for his enemies down the road. Now, the political ground under Cicero's feet was starting to shift. A totally new kind of power was rising in Rome, one that wasn't based on laws or speeches, but on armies and personal loyalty. And Cicero, a man of rigid principles, well, he just couldn't adapt. He was suddenly up against something totally new, the First Triumvirate. This was basically a secret backroom deal between three of the heaviest hitters of the age: the military genius Julius Caesar, the incredibly wealthy Crassus, and the famous general Pompey the Great. So you've got this massive clash of ideas, right? On one side, you have Cicero's ideal, the Republic, where power comes from the law and the Senate. And on the other, you have the Triumvirate's reality, where power comes from personal ambition, from money, and from armies. They actually invited Cicero to join them, but he refused. He saw their alliance as totally illegal and against everything the Republic stood for. It was a principled stand, for sure, but it was also a disastrous political miscalculation that left him completely on the outside looking in. And he just kept underestimating his rivals. Get this, he looked at Julius Caesar, a guy who was famously vain about his thinning hair, and he just dismissed him. He couldn't see past the carefully combed hair to the ruthless, world-conquering ambition simmering underneath. It was a profound and ultimately fatal misjudgment of character. So fast forward, Caesar is assassinated, Rome is thrown into chaos, and Cicero sees one last chance to save the Republic he loves. He decides to make his final stand, aiming his verbal weapons at a new target, one who was even more ruthless than Caesar. He zeroes in on Caesar's right-hand man, Mark Antony, as the next great threat. And he launches this series of absolutely vicious speeches against him. They're called the Philippics. He didn't just attack Antony's politics. He went for the throat, attacking his character, his personal life, everything. It was a rhetorical declaration of all-out war. His next move? Well, it was his final, fatal mistake. He tries to play kingmaker. He thinks he can use Caesar's young, unknown heir, a kid named Octavian, as a pawn against Antony. His plan, in his own words, was to praise the young man, use him, and then dispose of him. But Octavian was way smarter than Cicero gave him credit for. He almost certainly found out about this condescending plan, and you can bet he never forgot the insult. So instead of fighting Antony, he does the one thing Cicero never saw coming. He forms an alliance with him. Together with another general, Lepidus, they create the Second Triumvirate, and with that single move, Cicero's fate was sealed. With his two most powerful enemies now working together against him, the end came fast. The very political machine Cicero had spent his life defending was now turned against him with brutal, unstoppable force.
The new triumvirate brought back an old, terrifying political tool: proscription lists. These were basically public, government-sanctioned hit lists. To seal their deal, they all agreed to sacrifice some of their own friends and family. And Mark Antony had one demand that was absolutely non-negotiable. The name Marcus Tullius Cicero had to be on that list.
And the revenge was just brutally personal. It wasn't enough to just kill him. Antony had Cicero's head and hands, the sources of his power, nailed to the speaker's platform in the Senate. And according to one story, Antony's wife, Fulvia, then took the head, pulled out Cicero's tongue, and repeatedly stabbed it with her hairpins. A final, symbolic act of hatred against the words that had tormented her husband.
So Cicero the man was silenced, brutally and forever. But his ideas? Well, they couldn't be destroyed. In a final, tragic irony, the very writings that Antony wanted to punish so badly would become Cicero's greatest legacy. His speeches, his letters, his philosophy, they were all carefully saved. They survived the fall of Rome itself and went on to shape the thinking of the American founding fathers, of European philosophers, and of countless leaders for the next 2,000 years. So you see, in the end, his voice was never really silenced at all. And that brings us right back to the heart of Cicero's tragedy. He was a brilliant man. He saved the Republic. But he was too rigid, maybe too principled, to adapt to the brutal new politics of his time. And his story leaves us with this really difficult, timeless question. When the system you believe in is crumbling all around you, is it better to die for your principles or to make the compromises you need to survive?